We're going to take another example of choice implying meaning out of Ephesians 5. And here we're going to be looking at the choice, again, of the use of participles and the impact it has on the shaping and prioritization of the message. So here, instead of the blue highlighting indicative verbs, it's highlighting the imperative verbs, and the participles are in yellow. And what we've said earlier is the circumstantial participles have the effect of backgrounding the action. The participles that follow the main verb, in this case following the imperative verbs, have the effect of elaborating on the main action. So they are modifying and supporting it, but they have the specific effect of elaborating, in essence spelling out in more detail, what does this practically look like? What does this imperative look like in practice? So we've got a command in verse 15 to consider how we live, not as unwise but as wise, in the elaboration of verse 16, making the most of the time because the days are evil. In verses 17 and 18, we've got a series of 4 commands. Again, not to be foolish, but to understand, not to become drunk, but to be filled with the Spirit. And we're going to be drilling down a bit on verses 19 and following, because the command to be filled with the Spirit, I would argue, is elaborated by 5 participles that follow. Now, oftentimes these participles are labeled as imperatival participles, and I think that has more to do with how they should be translated into English than describing what they're doing in Greek. If Paul had wanted to make these participles imperatives, he could have used an imperative verb. He could have told us to speak to one another instead of having it be describing and elaborating the action. The choice to use a participle has a meaning, and we need to not overlook that, even if we have constraints in our translation about wanting to translate these participles into English as imperatives. So the command to be filled with the Spirit is fleshed out with 5 different ideas. So what does it practically look like to be filled with the Spirit? Well, it looks like speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. It looks like singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. It looks like giving thanks always for all things. And it looks like being subject to one another. Now, there's some controversy here about how to divide this passage up. Because if you notice, verse 21 does not have any capitalization where verse 22 does, and that gives us some indication about how the editors of the critical text rendered things. Now, if we take a look at the RSV, they will take verse 21 as though it was the beginning of a new paragraph here. If we look at the net, they begin a new paragraph at verse 22. The ESV begins again with verse 22, NIV again with verse 22. But I would argue that by virtue of the choice to use participles says that verse 21 and following, regardless of how we might break it as a new paragraph, is elaborating on the one imperatival action that precedes it, the one main action, which would be filled with the Spirit. What does it look like to be filled with the Spirit? Well, it looks like being subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. And I would argue that verse 22 is essentially elaborating on verse 21. Well, what does it look like to be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ? Well, it looks like wives being subject to their own husbands as to the Lord. Notice that there's not even a verb in verse 22. Verse 22 is dependent on verse 21 for the verbal action. You don't very often find a brand new section, a brand new pericope starting without a verb of some kind. That creates, there's a tremendous amount of dependence of 22 on verse 21, just as verse 21 is dependent on verse 18 for the command to be filled with the Spirit. So here we see some meaning that can be drawn from the choice on Paul's part to use participles, or in verse 22 to use a verbless clause. It has the effect of subordinating this complex that follows verse 18 to what precedes. Now notice that the next main imperative that we have, the next main verb, we don't come down to until verse 25, which is husbands, love your wives. There it's clearly beginning a new section, and the versions will represent it as that. But I think it's important that we not lose track of what's going on in Greek in our translation and move to English. Translation is one thing, exegesis is another. The choice to use a participle has implications and has meaning, and we need to pay attention to that. So this gives us another example of how that understanding that choice implies meaning can really sharpen our exegesis and give us better insight into what Paul was trying to accomplish.